Hey, it's me, your boy Blue Getsuga, and today I'll be doing my Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier analysis video on Dragunitys and Mutants, as promised. You know, the Mutants part, not the Dragunity part, because apparently no one cares about Dragunitys. Anyways, Dragunitys are a Synchro archetype. They're made up of winged beast monsters and dragon monsters, but mostly dragon monsters. Dragunitys have been getting a lot of support, and I mean like a lot of support, and it's actually pretty insane and fun. This deck is pretty fun to play with, and yeah, I'm just gonna get right into the pros without spoiling anything, even though you guys could already see this, but without saying everything I need to say, that's making all this kind of pointless and redundant. For the pros, we have Master Rule 5, meaning that you can spam as many synchro monsters as you want, assuming you're able to do so consistently. This deck has great boss monsters because a lot of their synchros are pretty good, especially their newest synchro, which essentially negates and banishes things. It negates monster effects, and when it's killed, it's basically a duster for your opponent. This deck has good spells and traps. A lot of their spells and traps are combo starters, and some of you are fairly familiar with it because it's used in decks like Dragon Link, and I think that deck is the best deck in the format right now. And yeah, this deck is versatile because a lot of the synchros can actually do different things. Plus, this deck has a fair number of different win conditions. You can banish your opponent's monsters with cards like Ascalon. You can negate things with your counter trap as well as your newest Dragunity boss monster. You can actually just beat over your opponent's monsters with your huge boss monsters, as well as things like Dragunity Divine Lance, which you can actually use to actually equip that one level 1 tuner in the deck that allows you to attack twice, which is pretty great for OTKs. This deck is pretty versatile all around. Plus, this deck can also float. I guess to be more specific, Ascalon and the newest, the newest one can float. Oh yeah, and also the newest, the other newest one, the one that came out in Blazing Vortex, that can also help banish monsters in your opponent's graveyard. But of course, that's a bit situational, but it ties into how versatile this deck is. And this deck is fairly consistent due to all of its combo starters, and this deck has decent extensions, meaning, meaning that you can essentially just combo off like crazy. Solemn cards, of course, they feel bad because if your opponent just solemns one of your synchro monsters, then because it wasn't properly synchro summoned, that means you can't really summon it back from your graveyard like that, just like that. Plus, it can also just cut off your combo, especially since you need to have monsters on the field in order to actually do something. For example, like if your opponent imperms you, you can actually play through that. If your opponent Valors you, you can actually play through that. If your opponent ashes you, you can still play through that due to all your extenders. But if your opponent destroys your monster like with something like Solemn Strike or negates their summons, you're kinda screwed, and even then you still do have some extenders that can actually save you and continue your combo. Plus, people don't really play Solemns all that much because of how slow they are, because they're traps, even though they're ridiculously powerful. Even Solemn Strike is still ridiculously powerful, and it's shocking that it doesn't get played. And lastly, they can't play through more than 2 negates, for the reasons I mentioned above. They can extend fairly well, like really well, given what kind of deck there are. they are, but they obviously have their limits to how much they can play through. And on top of that, in a pure Dragunity deck, because mind you, when I do this series, I'm usually talking about a pure variant, or mostly a pure variant. They're not really going to be able to do too much to actually win game from where they're standing. But I would argue that this deck is a tier 2.5 deck rather than a tier 3 deck. Because this deck can actually steamroll a lot of tier 3 decks. But at the same time it can't compete with, tier 2 and tier 1 decks. Since a lot of the tier 2 decks can actually, they have a lot of they're usually decks like Altergeist and Guru, which this deck struggles against due to the back row. And, meta decks are pretty self-explanatory. The meta decks would actually stomp Dragunitys out. So that's why I would place Dragunitys as a solid tier 2.5. Next, we have our newest TCG exclusive, Myutants. Mutants are a fusion archetype, and yeah, I'm not really going to say too much here. I'm just going to go straight into the pros and cons. Excuse me. For the pros, Master Rule 5, I might as well not include this as a pro since you only have 2 fusion monsters and you aren't really going to consistently spam them, but as long as that option is there, that's pretty good. As long as you have the option to summon more than one fusion monster, which sometimes you might be able to do, I guess you could argue that Master Rule 5 is a pro. This deck has great boss monsters. Your Mutant Beast is a negate, which is just pretty good in general. Mutant Mist sucks ass. That shouldn't count as a great boss monster. And Arsenal, although it doesn't negate monster effects, but allows you to actually remove monsters from your opponent's side of the field. The problem is getting into those boss monsters. They aren't really hard to get into, but the main deck boss monsters. They aren't really hard to get into, but it does require you to actually give up a fair amount of resources, which this deck actually surprisingly is actually able to get back. Oh yeah, and then you also have your two fusion boss monsters, Ultimus, and I think Synthesis. Synthesis is arguably the best out of the two since it's very easy to summon, unlike Ultimus, which requires you to have 3 level 8 or higher mutant monsters. That and I think Ultimus is a lot harder to summon, but it is very powerful. And Synthesis allows you to be not untargetable, but unaffected by a card effect of a card that is activated. So if your opponent tries to Regeki you, you can make it unaffected by spells and by spell cards for the rest of this turn. And on top of that, when it's fusion summoned, you can actually pop a card, which works really well with one of their fusion spells. This deck is fairly consistent because the deck has, they have multiple searchers, and you have multiple ways of special summoning those searchers. You can special summon the searchers off of your field spell. You can special summon them off of your trap. You could also special summon them off of E-Telly since they're psychic monsters, or at least, the test tube versions of the mutants are psychic monsters. And and you can consistently get off the search effects of your level 2 and level 3 mutant monsters pretty easily. Since you can, like I mentioned with the field spell, you can banish one of them using another to summon Beast, and then you can just activate your Mutant Lab to special summon the one you banished and get another search that way. that's pretty cool. This deck has good search power, and they have a decent control playstyle since you can actually set up a couple of negates in this deck. And this deck can actually snowball advantage surprisingly enough. I guess the other thing I forgot to mention, this deck has good spells and traps. Because their spells and traps for the most part, they're pretty good. Wait, hold up. Spells, traps. Anyways, the spells and traps are good for the most part. Like, your expansion can help you special summon a mutant from your deck, plus it also protects your level 8 or higher mutants from destruction, which is pretty nice. And one of them helps you negate monster effects, and another one of it helps negate monster effects, but which is arguably the weakest of all the mutant spells and traps. And when one of your mutant monsters destroys your opponent's monster by battle or by card effect, I think. You actually get to draw one card, but again, that's pretty situational and unlikely to happen. And then you have your fusion trap card, which is pretty good because you can fusion summon on your opponent's turn and pop something with synthesis. And and it also makes summoning Ultimus very easily. It makes summoning it very easy, since you can also use your banished monsters, monsters on your field, as well as monsters in your graveyard as fusion material. And then you have the spells being Fusion Lab, again, pretty good. It's an extender. On top of that, it also helps you mulligan your hand. The equip card is kinda garbage. I say kinda because it's decent, but it's not all that great. And then you also have your fusion spell, which it isn't as good as a fusion trap card, but the fusion spell is pretty decent since it's essentially a fusion spell that a lot of fusion decks would probably kill to have. I'll just put it like that. And for the cons, this deck is a bit slow because I mean this deck runs a lot of traps, plus it requires a bit of setup to actually play. The fusions are a bit of a reach to summon, as shown here. Requires 3 level 8 or higher mutant monsters, and it requires a bit of setup for you to actually get into. And although Synthesis is the easier of the two to actually fusion summon, Synthesis also requires a bit of setup, since usually your you'd be using your small mutant monsters as well as one of your level 8 mutant monsters to actually summon it. And usually you'd want to reserve your level 8 so you can summon Ultimus, but sometimes you're actually going to have to resort to summoning Synthesis instead. Also, one other thing, Ultimus and Synthesis, they float. Because when they're destroyed, they get to actually add some of your banished cards to your hand. I mean, your banished mutant cards, to be more specific. And for the next con, they need more fusion monsters. They're kind of hard pressed on fusion monsters, but I guess that's to be expected since, again, they are a very new deck. For all we know, they might actually get more fusion monsters down the line. I certainly hope so, but given Konami's record with TCG exclusives, that's a bit of a pipe dream. Just a bit. And this deck can't play through more than one negate because this deck is actually fairly easy to trip up. Once you've stopped their momentum, it's hard for them to actually recover. Anyways, given the cards they have, I would say they're a tier 3 deck. They're pretty decent, they're fun, and you can take them to locals. And you could potentially win your your locals and have fun. But this deck isn't this deck isn't meta relevant yet. I say not yet. Like, who knows, in the future, Konami might actually give this deck some busted support, and this deck can actually be meta relevant. But as it is now, it's a far cry from being meta. It can potentially compete with rogue decks, but as far as meta decks, not so much. They're, like I mentioned, they're a bit slow, so but they do have a lot of options. They have a lot of trap options and control options to actually to go to. Which is why I would say that this deck is tier 3 instead of tier 3.5, because once this deck actually gets rolling, it's actually really powerful. But yeah, it's not all that powerful. At least not yet. Anyways, tell me what you think about Dragunitys as well as Myutants. And it's been me, your boy Blue Getsuga, and I'm out.